Okay, colleagues, greetings and welcome back. Today we continue our discussion of the history of Western political philosophical tradition by talking about David Hume. David Hume, who is widely considered to be the most important philosopher to ever write in the English language, and possibly one of the most important philosophers in the entire history of, of philosophy. So there's a lot to talk about. Let me just mention by way of introduction, when I was only beginning to do philosophy, basically in my first year, before I even decided to become a professional philosopher, two of the names that stood out for me, again, in the first year of my studies, were David Hume and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. There's an interesting connection between the two. They were actually friends for a time. Tragically, their friendship did not last because Rousseau suffered from fears of persecution, which were not entirely unfounded. Rousseau was deeply hated for his criticism of Christianity. His books were burnt. So not entirely without reason, Rousseau was somewhat paranoid, and this unfortunately led to the falling out between the two men. But again, the reason I was interested in them when I was basically in my first year of the university is that there's a very interesting element of social criticism. Criticism, skepticism in both Hume and Rousseau. So obviously we're going to talk in much more detail about Hume's skeptical project, but let me just try to sketch this out a little bit. Very often, I mean, when you look at the public discourse, there are all sorts of voices, and depending on where, my dear listener, you are listening to this, right? Different countries have different temperaments and dispositions. Very often you find critical voices in the air, but also very often, and in this course, I think Cephalus in Plato's Republic exemplifies this calm and sort of comfortable, maybe a little bit self-congratulating traditional morality. Cephalus, who thinks I'm a good person. We are good people. We are a good, just society, right? And in many ways, John Locke, I keep returning to the ideas of John Locke. I feel that John Locke, to some extent, takes the place of Cephalus in the second part of our course. Again, this person who believes that, of course, by the natural light of reason, all human beings know that there's a God, that they have obligations to take care of one another. All this sort of nice, again, this self-congratulating, a little bit maybe too complacent, right, attitude, right? And Rousseau and Hume, in this sense, are deeply exemplify the spirit of skepticism and social criticism against the likes of Cephalus, against the likes of Locke. And against Locke and Cephalus, Hume and Rousseau will point to the limits of human reason, to the limits of human rationality. Now, incidentally, as I already alluded to this will very importantly entail criticism of the natural law tradition. Both Hume and Rousseau are deep critics of the natural law tradition. Again, morality, society is not natural, it is artificial. In a deep sense, it is artificial. It has to be constructed and maintained through particular mechanisms. It doesn't come naturally or automatically, right? But also, again, this a little bit complacent and self-congratulating assertion on the part of, contemporary Lockeans, I would say, is this belief in the march of reason and progress, right? And Rousseau actually became famous as somebody who questioned the ideas of progress and who, very importantly, said that the progress of the arts and the sciences did nothing to improve the human condition. You will remember we drew this graph, lecture on Rousseau. It was a downward sloping graph. There's a natural period of innocence, and then there's the fall. And the fact that human beings acquire knowledge and skill through science and technology does not make human life better. It actually makes human life, or has the potential, according to Rousseau, does actually make human life worse because it gives sort of the negative tendencies in human psychology more power, more force. Again, the more powerful you are, the more power you have to harm yourself and to harm others, right? It's kind of the potentially deleterious effects of progress. And again, when I was in my first year, I was deeply impressed by this. And this is why I think methodologically speaking, Hume and Rousseau are so important, right? Whenever people have a tendency, in order to offer, again, these complacent, self-congratulating accounts, Rousseau and Hume are going to come and say, wait a second, let's think of the best arguments on the other side of the issue. Is it really true that there is progress over the last 1,000 or 100 years of history? Is it true that we actually live in a more enlightened, more humane society? Or could it be that future descendants will look at us with the same horror that we look, let's say, at the witch trials of the Middle Ages, right? Or of the horribly abusive regimes of serfdom that existed in the Middle Ages and were regarded by people widely as, again, natural and normal, right? And so kind of a bit of a general introductory overview, but I want to stress this very important progressive element. I think a very important, it's kind of negative, but it is a productive, negative critical, but a productive criticism, right, which is inherent in the philosophies of David Hume and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Now, importantly, this radicalism on the part of Hume and Rousseau, precisely because they are both aware, attentive to the limits of human reason, this radicalism actually, in both Hume and Rousseau, if we read them carefully, has important conservative implications, right? So it's like many people, maybe most people, are wrong. Many societies, maybe most societies are bad. Rousseau will say, Hume will not be as radical, but still Rousseau would say most societies are bad. But it doesn't mean that we should tear everything down and tomorrow we'll live in a better place. So, it's kind of, there's an interesting connection here between skepticism, social criticism, but also potentially conservatism. We should take it with a bit of nuance. And again, the social criticism is not a blanket endorsement of any kind of revolutionary or reformist projects. So again, and in this sense, I feel that both Hume and Rousseau offer very important, productive, fruitful, methodological precautions against too much optimism and too much complacency. Now, before we talk about the details, before we talk about Hume's philosophical project in detail, I want to take a moment to situate David Hume in the what I take to be the most important movement, the most important transformation in the history of Western philosophical and intellectual tradition more broadly. And this is, again, I'm obviously talking about this shift from the teleological to the mechanistic view of the world. So I've alluded to this in the past. Many contemporary philosophers, me included, believe that this is by far and away the most important intellectual transformation in the history of humanity. If you want to call this an idea, this is the most important idea in the entire intellectual history of humanity, right? This transition from the teleological view of nature as purposeful, organic, right? Teleological, coming from the Greek word telos, which means aim or purpose or goal. Again, that this universe is ordered, it is directed to a particular aim, and also, very importantly, that this universe has a natural hierarchy of value and goodness. Certain things are objectively good, objectively evil, according to the teleological worldview, and certain things are intrinsically valuable, and human life has a natural meaning or purpose. This is the teleological worldview, again, in our course, most readily associated with the name of Aristotle. And the transformation is that we bracket the teleological worldview and we move towards the mechanistic understanding of nature. So in the teleological worldview, the most important explanatory concept is aim or purpose. Everything has a natural purpose. In the mechanistic worldview, there are no purposes whatsoever. There are no purposes. There are only causes. Purposes are if you want something in the future, and we strive to achieve purposes in the future, whereas this mechanistic view of the world talks about causes pushing from behind, and whereas in the teleological worldview, purposes are rational, deeply rational, maybe orderly, maybe good. In the mechanistic worldview, nothing is good or evil in and of itself. We just have this blind, deterministic, mechanistic, maybe chaotic causation, right? And there are many names people could associate with this tradition, but let me just focus on these four. So the mechanistic worldview begins in many ways. Well, I mean, rudiments of mechanistic worldview already existed in ancient Greece with figures such as Democritus or Epicurus, but the mechanistic picture really comes to the fore through thinkers such as Galileo. There's also Copernicus and Newton, but let me just focus on the name of Galileo. Again, this idea that there are mathematical regularities in nature, which are not necessarily immediately good or evil. Again, I let go of the marker and it falls, not because this is necessarily good or it's trying to achieve some kind of good purpose, but simply because there's a mathematical regularity underlying nature. And it's, in the works of Newton, again, very importantly, it's the same regularity governs the motions of celestial bodies and governs things down below. The same law of motion, the same basic underlying principles of physical reality govern the regular motion, let's say, of the moon or of the sun with respect to the earth, but also the same laws of motion allow people to plant flowers or to, murder children, right? So it's kind of, the same laws of motion provide for all of this. It's kind of deeply pessimistic, later down the line is going to develop into a deeply pessimistic view of the world in which human beings do not necessarily have any kind of natural purpose, right? And so Galileo talks about the natural world, meaning physical, cosmos. But then Darwin expands the mechanistic picture to all living things and provides for a certain basic foundation for some kind of mechanistic theory of human psyche, human psychology. And later down the line, so again, Galileo talks about the mechanicism in the, with respect to the physical bodies. Darwin expands this to life. And then Nietzsche, Freud, and Marx, many others can be named, but these three names often get thrown around, to extend this mechanistic approach to, again, to the explanation of the workings of the human soul, right? Of the human psychology. Right? And in this sense, again, in the 21st century, again, the works of Alan Turing, this idea of AI, especially the program of strong AI, lends credibility to this entire approach. And again, what is important, this is a huge transformation. A whole course can be devoted just to exploring this. But I guess for our purposes, the most important insight from this picture we have already discussed when we talked about Thomas Hobbes, and we will see exactly the same thing when we talk about Hume today, again, is this notion that nothing is good or evil in and of itself. There is no natural law. There is no natural morality. As Hobbes says, whatsoever is the object of any man's appetite or desire, that is it which he calls good, and the object of his hate and aversion evil. When people say something is good, it just means they like it. Again, and we imagine that there's a mechanistic account, again, Darwin is going to talk about this, blind randomness which underlies, evolution, as we know today, again, just basically, chemical molecule, DNA, right? Evolves through random mutations, basically through copying errors, mostly, not only, but to a very large extent, right? So we have a mechanistic account of passions, and whatever beings like, they call good. Whatever they dislike, they call evil. It's an important element of relativism in this. What people call good, other alien species may call evil, or cultures are going to differ. People of different temperaments are going to differ. Again, what zebras find good and what lions find good is not necessarily aligned. Again, there is no one standard of right or wrong or goodness, right? And again, Hobbes talks about whatever is the object, whatever we like we call good, whatever we don't like we call evil. And David Hume is going to continue this line of reasoning. David Hume famously is going to say, reason is and ought to be the slave of the passion. Reason is and ought to be the slave of the passion. Reason is nothing but a rational calculator that helps you achieve the goals, but the goals are given to you by your nature. Again, today we would say that the goals are pre-programmed by some combination of biological and cultural evolution, right? But they are derived from this mechanistic process of natural and cultural selection, not through any kind of divine or transcendent intervention. And Again, so the reason for me to draw out this picture is, again, to situate David Hume. And again, the way David Hume falls into this picture is that, like Hobbes, David Hume is going to try to offer, again, as what he calls an experimental or an empirical account of human nature. Again, for our purposes, most importantly, this is going to lead to a certain kind of emotivist or non-cognitivist theory of morality. That morality is nothing but a reflection of interest. Whatever people like, they call good. Whatever people dislike, they call evil. And there's nothing else to signify, to underlie the notion of good in the individual human psychology. And this is basically the basis of morality. The notion of underlies morality. And then when we talk about politics, politics is, broadly speaking, legitimate politics is nothing but talking about, if you want, common likes and dislikes. So common good is nothing but common interest. And again, I mentioned last time that this is also the way I interpret Rousseau. So this is by far not the only idea in Hume, but I want to say, at the outset of the lecture, this is going to be the most important idea in Hume for us down the line. So in the next segment, let's talk about Hume's philosophy in order and in detail. So, at the root of Hume's philosophy, we have his empirical method, his deep commitment to empiricism. Now, it's a complicated question, and philosophers debate this to no end, but I feel that, again, Hume's commitment to empiricism is a principled commitment to empiricism. And like when we look around the world, when we try to examine the workings of our own mind, it seems that at the end of the day, the only secure basis for making any kind of assertion is an empirical basis. Now again, throughout the history of Western philosophy, the temperaments change and different approaches are preferred at different times. But I feel that ever since the scientific revolution, empiricism was in ascendance. And basically today there's a certain broad consensus that for any kind of claim to be justified, it needs to be borne out by experience, by shared experience of you and me and of everybody, right? But there's immediately a very interesting link between empiricism and skepticism, because again, empiricism, which is reliance on the sense data, on the empirical data of the senses, experience, right? What experience shows us almost immediately is that human mind is prone to error. I'm going to talk about rational derivations in the moment, in a moment. But whenever we talk about some kind of logical argument, we know, as a matter of empirical fact, most of us, all of us, I'm sure you've had this experience as a matter of experience, when you made a logical derivation, let's say mathematical calculation, and it turned out to be wrong. You've made a mistake. So experience shows us that our mind is limited, and the rational faculty is limited and is prone to error. But also empiricism shows that reliance on experience shows that reliance on experience is also liable to lead us to error. The simplest, most immediate cases, you walk down the road and you see a person off in the distance, you come closer and you realize, oh, it was not a person, it's just a tree, right? So experience shows the limits of experience. And this argument can be extended much deeper. If we had more time, definitely we would talk about Rene Descartes. Rene Descartes, a philosopher writing before Hume, has this very famous, or maybe infamous, notorious argument, skeptical argument about the evil demon. And it's an argument in stages. Descartes begins by talking about illusions of perception, which I already mentioned. But then Descartes amplifies this argument by saying that, imagine me talking to you right now. I have this impression of standing in front of a glass board, talking to a camera. But Descartes is going to say, I had experiences in the past when I was dreaming, and while I was asleep, it was not obvious to me that I was asleep. In fact, I thought, I had thoughts, feelings, passions, worries, right, as if I was awake. And then suddenly I wake up, I realize, oh, it was just a dream. So how can I guarantee to myself that I'm not sleeping right now, that all of this is happening? And again, it seems from within an empirical framework, it is impossible to prove. Moreover, Descartes says that as a matter of empirical fact, we observe some people who are mad and who believe, for example, that their body is made of glass. This is an example from Descartes himself. Illusions, one level of skepticism. The next level of skepticism, dreams. The next level, deeper level of skepticism is madness, which can lead people to believe in, contradictory, self-contradictory things, maybe. But even below that, Descartes says, and this argument has gotten even more traction in recent years with the advances in technology, right? But Descartes says, imagine that there's an evil demon who messes with my head and who makes me believe false things, maybe even about math, right? When I take, one object and two objects, and I put them together, 1, 2, 3, and I count them, maybe an evil demon is forcing me to make a mistake, is messing with my head. How can I guarantee myself, against this kind of idea? And I said that in recent years, of course, this figure of the evil demon has been replaced variously by, scientists who hook up a brain to some kind of machine. It's the idea of a brain in a vat. And again, as far as neuroscience tells us, it is in principle a feasible thing to do, right? To hook up all the neurons in your body to a particular machine so that any experience can be simulated with perfect fidelity. It's very difficult to do as a matter of practical fact, but in theory, it should be quite feasible, right? But also, evil scientists hooking us up to machines and messing with our perception of reality. But also, in addition to that, you can imagine, some kind of scenario which has to do with AI, robots, like in the famous movie The Matrix, or maybe aliens, again, messing with us. These ideas proliferate, right? But ultimately, what I'm driving at is that Descartes doesn't really have a successful resolution. He tries, but by general agreement, he fails to get out of this skeptical conundrum. And in many ways, Hume doesn't even try to get out of the skeptical conundrum. He asserts, yes, this is the nature of human predicament. Human mind is radically limited. And we do not have any kind of access to absolute truth with a capital T. No matter what kind of textbooks and physics you can have the best kinds of experiences. It is always possible for human beings to be mistaken, right? And again, if we had more time, we would go over this step by step. But Hume deploys his skeptical arguments against the method of induction, against the concept of causation, against the concept of the self or the soul, and also, again, keep talking morality, against the notions of natural, universal goodness or virtue. And in all of these cases, Hume's argument is basically that we never have sufficient empirical grounds to jump to scientific conclusions about natural laws, general laws of nature, or to jump to conclusions about the intrinsic causes of things, or to jump to the conclusions that there exists an immaterial or whatever, persisting self or soul, or to jump to the conclusions that there's a natural standard of goodness. And the reason why we assume this is not a rational reason, it is an irrational reason. We have passions. It's a good question, why do we have them? Again, but as a matter of empirical fact, I observe that I have passions. And these passions override my reason, and they drive me to accept faulty evidence and to jump to conclusions which are, strictly speaking, unwarranted. So again, if we had more time, I'd love to go into more detail, but let me just try to sketch. So when we talk about induction and causation, again, this is the notion that something repeats over and over and over again, and we jump to the conclusion that there's a natural regularity which underlies this. So, for example, if you take Newton's law, F is equal to m1 multiplied by m2 divided by r squared multiplied by constant g, right? Deep question, a very important question. This is an assertion of constant, exceptionless regularity, which obtains in all times and in all places. Could this kind of assertion ever be justified? And Hume basically says, that strictly speaking, the only thing that we can say that as far as our faulty memory serves us, as far as we can remember in the past, this formula seems to have matched the movement, of all the celestial bodies, or, think of experiments that we can do here on Earth. This formula seems to have approximated the movement of, these bodies, let's say of the moon around the Earth, to a certain kind of margin of error, because any kind of observation always has a margin of error built into it, right? But within this formula, there is no guarantee, within our empirical evidence, there is no guarantee that this regularity is going to continue to hold into the future, or will continue to hold, in other parts of nature. Again, basically what Hume is saying is that when we conclude, when we deduce this formula, bracketing out the question of error bars, measurement error, bracketing out the question of measurement error, underlying this kind of formula is the assumption of uniformity of nature in space and time. Uniformity of nature in space and time. If you want to oversimplify, the assumption that future will resemble the past. And Hume latches onto this and says, how can you know that future will resemble the past? Okay, maybe in the past, future had resembled the past, but you cannot extrapolate what happened in the past into the future without assuming that future will resemble the past. It's a deep thought. Again, if we had more time, we'd talk more about it. I encourage you to think about this in your own spare time. But an example will suffice. An example will suffice. So ever since Newton has made his discovery, again, people were confident, so vast numbers of people were confident that Newton's formula was completely correct and borne out by evidence. And then, of course, comes Einstein. And Einstein shows us that no, in fact, as far as we can tell, other observations have come up, and they have shown, they have, proven to most people's satisfaction that this formula is actually, strictly speaking, wrong. That there are regimes in which this formula does not apply, like in the solar system. Well, strictly speaking, again, if your apparatus is precise enough, any kind of measurement can tell you that this formula is wrong. But one of the first measurements which has borne this out is the so-called precession of the perihelion of Mercury. The orbit of Mercury was first observed to not follow this formula, and this was a very important test of Einstein's notion. And I want to say that in general, again, we have the skepticism, empiricism, and this goes hand in hand with the scientific revolution, right? So the first ideas of corpuscular or atomic theory proposed by Robert Boyle, or again, like maybe even Newtonian method, right? Drives us to ask this question: are we capable of really understanding what the fundamental reality is like, right? And all of these skeptical worries are multiplied tenfold with the advent of modern physics, especially with the advent of quantum mechanics, right? Quantum mechanics is notoriously counterintuitive, and to this day there are deep disagreements about how to interpret the results of quantum mechanical experiments. There's the standard Copenhagen interpretation. There's so many, hidden variable theories, pilot wave theory, many worlds interpretation, right? So, it seems that, again, in the 21st century, there is no consensus as to what reality is fundamentally made of. And so, again, what I'm driving at is that Hume, I think, was very pertinent, very plausible in his own time. But as time went by, and as physics became more and more detached from the everyday intuitions, Hume's insights became more and more relevant. And again, Albert Einstein actually credited David Hume, reading David Hume, as an inspiration for his theory of general relativity. Einstein actually says that if he hadn't read Hume, he would not have had the courage to challenge Newton. Right, so it's an interesting constellation of various ideas here. So to somehow bring this section to a close, again, Hume's skeptical arguments are all similar in character. So induction, this extrapolation beyond the experience, tells us we do not perceive all times and all places. Right? I do not perceive, I do not have the experience of the future now. So strictly speaking, I do not know what the future is going to be like. For irrational reasons, my passions drive me to have expectations about the future. But strictly speaking, these expectations are unfounded, right? Likewise, causation. I do not actually see the causes of any particular action. So again, I let the marker go and it falls, but do I perceive the force of gravity as a cause? No, not really. It is more of an irrational, hypothesis which doesn't have any kind of solid proof beyond it. If you think of physiology, I want my arm to go up, and the arm goes up. But again, if we trust the neuroscience, there are so many steps along the way, having to do with neurotransmitters, neurons, axons, firings, end plates, whatever, right? I do not perceive any of this chain. It seems to me, okay, I wanted my arm to go up and it went up, right? So, but I jump toward, to these conclusions that, my volition is the cause of my arm going up. But unbeknownst to me, physiology tells me that there's all this machinery. Of course, the story that the physiology tells me is also just a story of correlations. It's also just a story of one thing followed by another. Do we really know? Does the science provide ultimate justification, ultimate explanation of the world? Hume would say no. Hume would say no. So again, induction causation, the self, similar. I do not have the experience of myself. If I close my eyes, all sorts of thoughts, feelings, perceptions, impressions, but there is nothing which is, strictly speaking, me. And there's no reason, no rational reason, Hume says, for me to assume that I exist as the same entity from moment to moment. Yeah, I have a memory of the past, but the memory is something that exists right now. For all I know, maybe the world was created a moment ago, like literally 1 moment ago, with me, with all my memories intact. And maybe I will be destroyed in the next moment. But even when I say I, right, this is in some sense David Hume foreshadowing people like Friedrich Nietzsche and Sigmund Freud. How do I know that I myself is one thing and not a constellation of different souls trapped in the same body, or different organs trapped in the same body, or like a symbiotic relationship of thousands, I should say millions, or trillions even, of different cells. Trillion maybe is a bit too much, but you understand, like a myriad of different cells working in concert. And likewise, applied to, again, these notions of goodness and virtue, Hume is going to say, obviously, we have perceptions of things such as pleasure and pain. Yes, we perceive them, but do we have the experience of, again, like ultimate standard of goodness or justice? We can maybe add God to this picture, and Hume will offer very important, very powerful criticisms of what he calls natural religion, and in general, like an anti-theological arguments. But still, just to focus on the notion of goodness or virtue, again, Hume is going to say we definitely perceive things that we like and things that we don't like, but we are never warranted to jumping to conclusions beyond our experiences that some things are good in and of themselves for all times and in all places. I hope that you can see a certain kind of parallel between all of these. So again, let me bring this section to a close. Again, I encourage you to read David Hume, or about David Hume, to learn more about these ideas. I think that they're fascinating. But in the next segment, I'll talk about some more technical details of Hume's philosophy. Now, in this segment, I want to do a very brief rundown of some technical aspects of Hume's epistemology, of Hume's theory of knowledge. If this was a course in general course in philosophy, we'd maybe spend a whole lecture on this, but alas, time is short. So Hume introduces a distinction, and this appears to be a very fruitful distinction. By and large, this is accepted to this day, general philosophical outlook. So Hume is going to say that our statements, and in case our statements are true, then our truths, right? So truths or statements come in two flavors. Synthetic statements or truths, and analytic statements or truths. Now, these terms, synthetic and analytic, I think are due to actually Leibniz. Hume calls them matters of fact and relations of ideas. So some statements are true or false by virtue of matter of fact. Some statements are true or false by virtue of relations of ideas. So the matters of fact rely very much on empirical observations. Right? So an example could be, there's a glass board in front of me right now. That's a true empirical statement. It is cold and snowing right now. That's a false empirical statement, false matter of fact. Now, and this is, broadly speaking, associated with induction. I mentioned induction already in the previous segment a little bit. Now, on this side of the board, we have analytic statements which are true or false by virtue of relations of ideas. They are supposed to be not empirical, but purely rational, purely logical, right? For example, an example of a true analytic statement would be all triangles have three sides. An example of a false analytic statement is going to be, let's say, all triangles have four sides or something like that. These are the two broad classes of knowledge, and Hume is going to insist that no other possibilities exist. Now, Immanuel Kant in the next lecture, we'll see, tries to challenge this dichotomy, but many philosophers do not think that Kant has succeeded, right? So it's going to be a big question whether Kant actually is able to contribute anything to this picture. So, but this distinction seems to be robust. Now, the problem with both sides of the board, I mean, Hume is going to point to problems with both sides of the board, and this is going to be, again, the vindication of his skepticism, right? So if we talk about matters of empirical fact, now, of course, it is true right now that I see the glass board. Let's say I have an impression of a glass board in front of my face. That is definitely true. Or as Descartes could say that maybe the evil demon is deceiving me, but it's, I certainly have certain impressions right then and there. So Descartes, for example, has this famous statement, cogito ergo sum. I know that right now I exist. Even if evil demon is deceiving me about everything, still, very, very obviously, very patently, at this moment, I am having certain kinds of impressions, right? And I cannot be mistaken about that. And that may be true. That may be true. Immediate sense data has a certain kind of immediate veracity. The problem comes when we try to generalize. So we say, let's say the sun rises in the east every morning. And this has happened over and over and over and over again. Is it going to happen tomorrow, right? Can we generalize? And Hume basically, again, I mentioned this is the problem of induction. Hume basically wants to say a certain thing can happen a million, a billion times, a trillion times, and this is never a guarantee that the regularity will continue into the future, right? And ever since Hume wrote, actually now we have more reasons to agree with David Hume. Again, you can think of some extravagant scenarios, I don't know, some kind of eschatological apocalypse such that the laws of nature break down for miraculous reasons, but you don't even have to postulate miracles, right? There are interesting physical hypotheses which, for all we know, may be true. For example, there's a possibility that the Higgs field has a false vacuum and could quantum tunnel to a different value. And if this were to happen, then there would be catastrophic change in the operation of the basic laws of physics propagating at the speed of light all throughout the universe, such as, for example, stable matter would be impossible. And this could happen in principle. There's if this theory is true, and there are reasons to believe it's true, this could happen with a calculable probability in the next moment. All laws of physics will break down because of this, possibility. And again, in times of Hume, it was more difficult to imagine, but now, again, like within our best models of the universe, within the standard model of particle physics, within the quantum field theory underlying the standard model of particle physics, there are actually reasons to believe that this could happen. And again, that all regularities that we are used to could cease to operate in the next moment, right? So this is basically the problem of induction. Again, the simplest way to phrase the problem of induction is that we cannot, because we do not perceive, because we do not have experience of the future, we cannot guarantee that future will continue to resemble the past. In the past, future had resembled the past, but how do we know that in the future will continue to resemble the past? This seems to be an unwarranted assumption. So this is the empirical side of the board. Now, what is Hume's criticism of the rational or the logical side of the board? And in the 20th century, now we have interesting problems of deduction, which are associated with the names of Kurt Gödel and Ludwig Wittgenstein, which basically have to do with if we follow a rule according to a rule, do we need then an infinite regress of rules? Do we run into an infinite regress of rules? So there's also kind of circularity in the problem of deduction. But that's a bit too technical. Hume has a simpler argument. against sort of rational analytic derivations. He says, okay, so I say that all triangles have 3 sides, or let's say 2 plus 2 is equal to 4. But Hume says, I know that in the past, when doing a mathematical calculation, 2 plus 2 is equal to 4, that's one thing. But let's say 15 times 19, that's slightly more difficult than 2 plus 2 is equal to 4. What is that equal to? I know that in the past I have made mistakes. So actually and again, like for Hume, in many ways, when I do a mathematical problem in my head, this is a question, this is also an empirical question. It's a question of internal perception. I perceive the internal working of my mind, right? So in some sense, all of our knowledge is derived from experience. So even the analytic knowledge is derived through a kind of internal experience. That's neither here nor there. So anyway, so Hume knows that in the past I've made mistakes. But the problem is that my memory could also be faulty. This is why I have these words, memory and error, on the board. So when I try to estimate how trustworthy my mind is, I could also make a mistake. So if I'm trying to estimate the trustworthiness of my estimate, the error bars, the uncertainty becomes larger. I could then try to estimate the uncertainty of the estimate of my estimate. You understand, right? And so every time I do this iterative procedure, the error bars, the uncertainty is going to become larger and larger and larger until the point that basically my confidence in the trustworthiness of my rationality is going to be like from minus infinity to plus infinity, right? It's going to be completely uncertain, like with every iterative step, because I know that sometimes my memory is unreliable. This leads to proliferation of this error. Again, it's a kind of a vicious regress. And again, philosophers ever since Hume tried to refute these skeptical arguments, but I think that by general consensus, all of these attempts have failed. So this seems to be the state of knowledge in the 21st century. If you open the best textbooks, especially textbooks in philosophy of science, any kind of good textbook which is worth its money, it's going to tell you that the best sciences that we have do not tell us any kind of certainties or truths with capital T. The best thing that human beings have are hypotheses which seem to be useful and seem to accord to the data, but we are never entitled to claiming that we have any kind of arrived at the knowledge of the truth with capital T. This is the general disconcerting drive of Hume's philosophy. And again, we're going to see down the line in a little bit the implications that this general picture has for morality and politics. So I think there's a characteristic feeling of vertigo, of losing the ground beneath one's feet, that every student of philosophy should experience after reading maybe Descartes, but to a larger extent after reading David Hume. And I feel that sort of this realization of the limits of human pretensions to knowledge is a necessary basis for doing philosophy today. And of course, when we talk about limitations of reason, there's a very important implicit argument against theology, against belief in God, implicit in Hume. And it's kind of an interesting point. We'll talk about it separately. Hume, in our course, is probably the first completely thoroughly atheistic philosopher. Now, Hume could not come out and say he was an atheist back in his day because this was politically unacceptable. He'd get into trouble, but the close reading of his work, I feel, provides a very strong foundation for this claim that, again, Hume was completely atheistic. And again, the famous account is Hume was dying on his deathbed, and some of his friends expected a conversion, and Hume, in this philosophical hagiography of how proper philosophers should die, remained cheerful, remained conversant up until the very end, and was saying that the belief in the immortality of the soul is the most incredible fancy. So to the very end, remained committed. It's kind of an interesting point because many philosophers that we saw before, especially John Locke, for example, would believe that atheists cannot be good citizens. Atheists cannot keep promises. So Locke very straightforwardly, has a theological foundation for his argument. But actually Rousseau, whose religious ideas are much more problematic, much more uncertain. I mean, I think it's hard to see Rousseau as a straightforward believer, right? He certainly had doubts, right? And Rousseau, first and foremost, asserted the necessity of civil religion for political reasons. So he says that even though Rousseau might not have believed in God himself, but still Rousseau thinks that there's a certain kind of secular profession of faith which is linked to patriotism, which is necessary for the well-functioning of society. And David Hume will have none of this, right? David Hume, again, himself was an atheist, and again, by all accounts of his biographers, was actually a very pleasant person to deal with. So, can atheists keep promises? Some philosophers are tempted to question that, but again, David Hume, or if we think back to the ancient philosophers, Epicurus would exemplify of how traditional moral virtue can go together with atheism, right? How atheistic philosophers still can act and behave in pro-social ways. And again, we'll talk about conservative, humanistic, tolerant political philosophy of David Hume in a moment. And in general, Hume was a skeptic, so maybe it's better to call him an agnostic rather than an atheist, but he was definitely an opponent of what back in the day was called enthusiasm, which is religious fanaticism. And so many of modern philosophers will write against religious fanaticism. Again, in the most immediate sense, we can think about the 30 Years' War, and actually, this is an important part in Hume's own understanding of his skeptical project. He's going to say that errors in philosophy are mostly just ridiculous, but errors in religion can be truly dangerous and lead to people, slaughtering each other by the thousands or tens of thousands. But be that as it may, right? If Hume is skeptical of religion, is skeptical of reason, what then is the basis of life for Hume? And the general idea, again, even though Hume did not associate himself with ancient skepticism, or the ancient Pyrrhonian skepticism of Sextus Empiricus, I think that actually a close reading of both Hume and Sextus shows a deep affinity between the two philosophers, even though, again, Hume did not call himself a Pyrrhonian skeptic. And in both Hume and Sextus, there's this phrase about acquiescing before the feelings which force themselves upon us, right? So again, with Descartes, I can doubt the existence of the external world. I can doubt the existence of my body, no end. I can drown myself in skeptical doubt, but still, I wake up in the morning and I find myself with certain dispositions, with certain desires, with certain aversions. And, it's difficult to resist them, right? Again, like if you stand in the middle of the road and there's a truck rushing towards you, it takes enormous amount of courage and self-discipline to stay in place. In some sense, your body takes over. So in this sense, again, the solution to the problem of skepticism is not a rational solution. It is an irrational solution. Human beings, again, as a matter of empirical fact, do we know the deep reason behind this? No, we don't. But as a matter of empirical fact, we have passions, and these passions are stronger than our reason. So even though reason is incapable of dispelling clouds of doubt, nature, our natural tendencies, our natural desires and aversions suffice to that purpose. It is very difficult, in fact impossible, Hume would say, to sustain the skeptical attitude throughout the day. There's no reason for me to believe that water quenches thirst. There's no rational reason to believe, but I have an irrational desire which overrides my skeptical doubts. In this sense, there's a deep affinity between what Hume is saying and what later philosophers such as Nietzsche or Heidegger or maybe Freud, Lacan is going to talk about, again, that human beings, again, find themselves with certain dispositions. And again, this irrational basis of human life. And Heidegger, Lacan, and Nietzsche are going to point to a certain important social component of our dispositions, in the sense that we, human beings, as a matter of empirical observation, right, we react to one another. We have these natural feelings of sympathy. Again, like society gets under our skin. It's kind of just think in terms of natural sympathy. If you see somebody in pain or in distress, most anatomically normal human beings also tend to feel distressed. Right? We don't, by and large, enjoy gratuitous violence. Again, it's an empirical observation of empirical fact. And likewise, sharing a smile is naturally pleasant. So there's an important assertion, could remind us of Aristotle, that human beings are by nature social. And now, in David Hume, this is not a teleological statement, but it is a statement of empirical fact, contingent statement of empirical fact, that most human beings are born with particular natures. And of course, Hume is writing before Darwin, but later, Darwin in terms of evolutionary biology, and later scientists in terms of evolutionary psychology are going to try to provide a mechanistic basis, mechanistic explanation of where these passions come from. So we are, if you want, we appear to be pre-programmed by biology to believe certain things about the world, but our biology doesn't know any truths about the world. Even if we have quote-unquote innate ideas pre-programmed by evolution, still evolution can only rely on past regularities, right? So what I'm driving at is that, again, if we think of Darwinian account of passions, this will only strengthen Hume's skeptical project. This is what I'm driving at. So let's proceed from talking about these general abstract terms. Let's talk about, again, morality, politics, and much more importantly about what Hume perceives to be the universals of human nature that most human beings share. So Hume's basis for the discussion of morality and politics must be grounded in his empirical method. So whatever Hume says, right, the way we verify or falsify his ideas is by looking at our experience and experience of other people around us. Hume's observations are going to rely on certain universals or constants of human nature. But again, Hume's own skeptical method is going to tell us that human nature need not be constant. So there could be exceptions. This is something, to be kept in mind, because this is going to have some implications actually down the line. So Hume is going to say that the situation that we find ourselves in is a situation of limited scarcity and limited compassion. That we have resources, but resources are limited, but also at the same time, we have certain natural sympathies, as a matter of empirical fact, again, as a contingent fact of human nature. We have these natural sympathies, but the natural sympathy is also limited. It's not limitless. And basically, Hume's account, Hume is going to be very critical of the social contract tradition. We're going to have to talk about this in a moment. But Hume's account, he imagines that maybe in the past, societies were small, and small societies kind of relied mostly on this natural feeling of limited compassion. So let me maybe try to flesh this out some more. So what do I mean by limited scarcity and limited compassion? So if the resources were so limited that in order for me to survive, you have to die, then society would be impossible. On the other hand, if resources were so abundant that there was never a scarcity of anything, then politics would be unnecessary. But we find ourselves in this middle intermediate situation. There are some resources, but they're not limitless. So there's some cause for conflict, if you want. On the other hand, if people absolutely had no compassion whatsoever towards one another, then we would just drown in this Hobbesian war of all against all. On the other hand, if human beings were linked as if by a hive mind, and I would immediately perceive your pains and pleasures as my own, again, there would be no need for politics. So in the words of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, I want to summarize this by saying that Jean-Jacques Rousseau famously states on the social contract, the difference of interest, limited scarcity if you want, and limited compassion, kind of insufficient abundance and insufficient compassion, right? Difference of interest makes society necessary. Difference of interest makes society necessary. Commonality of interest makes society possible. But again, notice this is not natural law. I have to keep reminding everybody, right? We're not talking about natural goodness. We are talking about common interest, which is defined by contingent facts about observable human nature, which in principle can change, right? So again, difference of interest makes society necessary. Commonality of interest makes society possible. So the rules of justice refer to common interest first and foremost, and the common interest in many ways is contingently discovered by looking at particular circumstances of human nature. Now, immediately let me mention this. Throughout the ages, it seems that some people behave in ways which do not point to a common interest. So psychology on this is kind of complicated, so it's hard to say, but maybe some people by birth or by nature are psychopaths or sociopaths. Is it true? I'm not sure. I'm not convinced by looking at medical literature. But certainly there's a possibility that a person is born who has absolutely no common interest with us. Imagine an individual who, in order to be happy, needs to drink fresh human blood, and otherwise they're just completely miserable. Well, you see, for Hume, with such people, you can have no society, no security. You have no common interest with them. And so basically what you're going to do is, you're going to act in self-defense. You're going to maybe kill or quarantine these kinds of individuals. But notice, you are not saying that they are irrational. You are not saying that they are maybe immoral. Or, when you say that they are immoral, you do not mean that they are irrational. What you mean, the cash value of your statement, is that they are inhuman. They are not sufficiently like you. But, notice, if we talk in this fashion, it's very clear. We're not talking about any kind of justice with a capital J. This is not justice with a capital J, right? This is a small j justice, which is simply the common interest. We do what we collectively like. We collectively dislike maniacs, psychopaths, and murderers, so we collectively, as a matter of self-defense, try to protect ourselves from these kinds of people. So there's a whole separate notion which we could talk about for a very long time, the idea of free will. And by and large, Hume is not going to believe in free will. As a skeptic, he cannot prove that the will is not free. But as a matter of empirical fact, he thinks that looking at the passions is enough to explain human behavior. So basically, Hume's model of how human mind works is that again, we have passions, and passions give us our goals. And then reason cannot give us the goals. Reason can only tell us what is the best way to achieve our goals. So reason is just an impartial neutral calculator. It's just a neutral calculator. And this is actually known as a famous is-ought problem. Is-ought problem. So passions tell us what we ought to do, but reason can only tell us what, how things are, or what is the best way to achieve the goals which are given externally. And this is a very important idea in Hume. This is maybe one of the most important ideas in Hume. I encourage you to think about this in your own spare time. This has actually come to the fore in recent years when people try to program artificial intelligence. It turns out that it's very difficult. You need to explain to a robot, you need to somehow program the utility function, right? Program the goals, program the values. This very often just is not something that we think about. Right? Imagine a conversation. You tell me, you should carry an umbrella. I say, why should I carry an umbrella? You say, because it's raining outside. Oh, yeah, that's a natural enough conversation. But Hume is going to say, no. You're saying, it is raining, therefore you should carry an umbrella. Something is missing, an ought is missing. So I could ask, okay, it's raining outside, why should I carry an umbrella? And you could say, well, you don't want to get wet. If you don't carry an umbrella, you will get wet. And I could respond, so I'll get wet. What of it? You see? So the implicit assumption is that I do not want to get wet. I ought not to get wet because that is going to be painful, right? Normally, we don't spell these things out in everyday conversations, but it's a very important tacit assumption behind this. So again, this is not Locke. We're not deriving values from any kind of universal standard of justice and goodness. We are deriving values from our common passions. We all equally do not like getting wet. We all equally do not like getting burnt. We don't like going hungry or going thirsty. So this is what defines our common interest. And if there's a person who, unlike most of us, derives extreme pleasure from murdering and torturing other people, and derives extreme suffering from not being able to torture and murder other people, right? We quarantine them, but not as immoral, because nothing is good or evil in and of itself. But we quarantine them because it goes against our common passion, commonality of interest. So, kind of a very important technical point in Hume. So, to round off this general discussion, let me also mention a couple other notions that Hume says. He draws this distinction between natural and artificial virtues. Natural and artificial virtues. So natural virtues, again, the word virtue is undefined. It doesn't mean anything by itself. So what we call virtue is what accords with the common interest. Whatever accords with the common interest, we call virtuous. Whatever does not accord with the common interest, we call vicious. Right? There's nothing over and above that. So the natural virtues is what most people, notice, I always have to add this, most, commonality of interest based on consensus of the majority, right? So most people, what they find naturally pleasant, we call this natural virtue. So let's say sharing, giving to alms, or sharing a smile. Again, an example which is often used, it's like you see a poor man in the street, and you give them some pity, you give them some extra money that you have. This is pleasant to you, as it very often is. You can try this as a thought. You can try this as a real experiment. It's actually, people often enjoy giving to others, giving gifts. So it's nice. You derive pleasure from it. The beggar derives pleasure from your pity. And actually, the onlookers looking at this interaction very often would, sympathize with both you and the beggar, and everybody feels happy naturally. So these are the natural virtues. And Hume is going to say that the natural virtues, they work like bricks in a wall. Each naturally good action makes the wall higher. So we're building a wall brick by brick, and each act of kindness, in this sense, makes the wall higher. And you see, small communities, like, again, this is not the notion of social contract. Like, small communities were based on these kinds of natural virtues, this kind of natural commonality of interest. But the problem is that societies, as they evolve, they become more and more complex. And as societies become complex, it becomes increasingly difficult to just rely on natural virtues. So, for example, stopping on the red light is not like giving to charity, giving alms, right? Stopping on a red light by itself does not feel good. If you, not to mention that, the fact that the light is red is just a convention. Like, which side of the road do you drive on? It's just a convention. Like, if you find yourself randomly in the middle of a jungle and there's, for some strange reason, there's a traffic light hanging on a tree and the light is red, it doesn't mean that you need to stop, and it's not pleasant, it's not naturally good. But when you stop on a red light as a part of a system of institutions, of, let's say, traffic regulation, only then it's good. And so this is the natural virtues, are like bricks in a wall. So this is the metaphor of a wall. The artificial virtues is the metaphor of an arch, where bricks individually are, so to speak, hanging in the air. I mean, this brick here, it's hanging in the air by itself. It is only, the structure is stable only because it is supported by all the other bricks. So stopping on the red light in the middle of the jungle is like a brick in an arch which hangs in the air without the arch. It falls down. Stopping on the red light is only good when you have a system of traffic regulations. Likewise, paying your taxes is only good within the system of, public taxation, public welfare. Or maybe observing property rights is good only when there's a system of property rights. So again, this is a wall and this is an arch. And this is, for Hume, this is the basic task of government. He wants to say that, again, small societies could have just done with natural virtues. And again, Hume, basically, from anthropological point, seems to be right. Like ancient prehistoric hunter-gatherers did not really need any elaborate system of government. But as societies become more and more complex, especially after the Industrial Revolution, you need this elaborate system of rules. And what the elaborate system of rules need is, again, you need basically rewards and punishments, a system of rewards and punishments to bring in line the interests of the individual, the short-term interests of the individual and the long-term interests of society. And also, very importantly, to rely on education. such that obeying the laws of society becomes second nature. So even though, in general, stopping on the red light is not good or bad, we don't have any immediate reactions to this, but society needs to educate us, give us a proper upbringing so that we stop automatically on the red light without even thinking about it. Develop a passion. And here again, passions are more important than reason. In this case, we are talking about habituation. We are talking about habit. And this is, again, a point which Hume actually shares with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, this belief in great importance of education, of habituation, of the moral basis of society. Laws are not by themselves good or bad. Good laws are insufficient by themselves. In addition to this, you need a certain kind of moral character. You need informal cultural institutions. You need habit. And habit very often just refers to automatic obedience, where people obey without thinking why they obey, without even thinking what is the reason as to why they obey. And this provides a justification for conservatism on the part of David Hume. David Hume is going to say that a bad law maybe often is not even worth changing just because it's an old law. Yeah, it's like a suboptimal law, like a less than perfect law, maybe is better left in place because people are habituated to following this law. If you change the law, this can introduce elements of chaos. So I would like to alert your attention to this interesting relationship between this account of passion and reason, and especially the role of habit in human nature, and Hume's conservatism, right? This is a special type of conservatism in David Hume. It is a secular, skeptical conservatism. Many brands of conservatism actually have religious or mystical basis behind it, but Hume, again, derives his conservative conclusions from a strictly secular, atheistic, and indeed empirical and skeptical bent of mind. So another important aspect of Hume's political philosophical project is actually his critique of the social contract tradition. Now, we already mentioned that Hobbes, it's a problematic question whether Hobbes is a social contract theorist. Hobbes basically says it's obey or die. It's not much of a choice. So I would say that mostly Hume's criticism is directed at Locke, again. Now, the way that Hume expresses this is that for philosophers like Locke, the basis of society is contract. So if you want, the basis of society is a promise. Contract is a kind of promise. I promise to obey the government, and you promise to obey the government. So the idea is that for somebody like Locke, it is a promise, an act of promising that establishes the society. And Hume finds that deeply problematic, because Hume is going to say, no, it's the other way around. It is because we have been brought up in society. It is because we have been taught and habituated to keep promises. Only that is why contracts are possible. So it's not that promise is the basis of society. It is society which is the basis of the institution of promising. Society is the basis of promise. So deep thought, conservative thought, we will see this. In principle, it's an important part of Edmund Burke's conservatism, and actually we will see this when we talk about Hegel. So let's try to unpack this some more. One thing that Hume is going to say is that, in principle, finding society on the institution of promises seems to be incoherent because it's circular, right? So you promise, but why should I trust your word? Because you promise to keep the promise. Again, this notion that sort of our regular, our obligations within society. So let's say I promise to pay you some money. So, and you could say I'm obliged to pay it because you can fall back on my original promise to keep the social contract. So it seems that my act of promising is substantiated by a prior promise. So essentially, Hume is going to say that what Locke does is, again, he founds the institution of promising on the act of a promise. So in some sense, you trust me to keep my word because I promised to keep my word. So you can ask, okay, why do you trust my promise to keep my promise? So you see, we run into an infinite regress. I promise to keep my promise, to keep my promise, to keep my promise, to keep my... This never ends. So Hume opts for an entirely different solution, and we already met his solution. He says, what happens is that human beings have a common interest, and this is the real basis of society. Hume gives the following example. Imagine two people are stuck in a boat in the middle of the ocean. They both want to get to shore. They have a common interest. They don't need to promise anybody anything. The promise does not work. You want to get to shore, and I want to get to shore. That's why we row together to get to the shore. So that's the broad outline. But much more importantly, when you talk about the legitimacy of any given society against the this complacent and naive contract theory of Locke, Hume is going to say, look, and Hume, among other things, was a historian known for his wonderful History of England. Locke knows that in terms of historical accounts, so many societies are actually based on tales of force, usurpation, violence, violent conquest. Where is consent in that? And, on the one hand. On the other hand, again, children, it seems that the immediate reason why children obey society and obey their parents, because there's threat of punishment, because society is just stronger. Say hi to Protagoras, say hi to Callicles, to Thrasymachus. There's a very important element of force and maybe even usurpation in the basis of society. And basically, Hume is going to say what makes this arrangement legitimate is not the fact that somebody promised. Nobody promises anything. For the vast majority of people, they do not sign pledges of allegiance to the government. Right? For the vast majority of people, the basis of government's legitimacy is just common interest. Common interest. Now, Hume does not have, David Hume does not have systematic, political philosophy in the way of that Hobbes, for example, had. So Hume does not strictly draw the line when legitimate government becomes illegitimate. But in general, again, he has this conservative outlook. Again, we talked about this natural and artificial virtues. And a very important part of artificial virtue is habituation, that people are, people don't even ask themselves this question, like, why do you obey a policeman? Why do you obey the magistrate? It's just, it's your second nature. You have been habituated since birth to obey policemen. And Hume is going to say this is functional. It's functional that people do this. That this obedience is, again, maybe in the words of Max Weber, this is traditional authority. It's unreflective authority. That's actually functional in terms of society. It helps stabilize the social bond. If people had to think before stopping at the red light, if people had to always think, and before they, let's say, show their documents to the policeman, society would be much harder to sustain, Hume believes. So again, his natural idea in terms of conservatism is that, of course, the magistrates and the police could acquire, think back to Rousseau last time, a corporate interest of their own, or a private interest of their own, and would be liable to abuse their power. But you see, Hume is going to say that the fact that society is based on force and usurpation, by the way, also against ideas of natural law, Hume is going to say there is no natural law of property. Property is only by convention. Nothing is good or nothing belongs to anybody, so to speak, in the state of nature, right? So anyway, the basic idea in Hume is going to be, unless the government is horrible, you should not rock the boat unnecessarily. Because the institutions that have been developed, that exist now, are a result of long history of trial and error. They grow organically, and changing things around, again, human mind is limited, so if you change things around, there could be all sorts of unforeseen circumstances, but also very importantly, laws are, old laws have this habitual element, people obey them habitually, so changing things around unnecessarily without a dire reason is in general not a good idea. So by and large, Hume would be a conservative. But at the same time, we have to understand that in Hume, exactly as in Hobbes, the legitimacy of the government is based on some form of maybe implicit consent of the governed, at least the general notion that the government is not too bad, is at least to some extent in the common interest. So although, careful, cautious reform is probably the best way to go. But of course, if the government becomes completely tyrannical, ruins your life, then it loses all pretense of legitimacy, and revolutions do happen, and there's nothing to make them illegitimate in Hume, yes, like in Hobbes. Although I have to point to this idea, and I think it's a very important idea, both for Hume and for Hobbes. I think we have to understand that talking about a right of revolution is a very problematic issue. Revolution, in an important respect, always involves the destruction of the conventional order and reconstitution of a new kind of affair, right? So in some sense, a genuine revolution can never be according to right. It's always against right. So there's some kind of dire circumstance for Hobbes when contract becomes void, or a dire circumstance for Hume when government becomes intolerable, and so the old order collapses, and now we need to reconstitute a new order. But this process always involves a certain element of, again, this forced usurpation. You have to go through this period of lawlessness if you want to transition from one order to another. Again, this is a big distinction between Hobbes and Hume on the one hand, and Locke on the other hand, who thinks that there could be a right of revolution. You can see this, again, natural law roots of Locke's ideas. So I have to keep constantly underscoring the difference of, let's say, Hobbes' thinking, Rousseau's thinking, now Hume's thinking with the tradition of the natural law. Again, in many ways, I feel, again, the notion is that I feel that if natural law tradition was right, we would not need political philosophy. It is precisely because society is not natural but artificial. Laws of justice are not natural but merely conventional. That is why we need political philosophy. Again, human beings are different. We have to find and renegotiate what is the common interest, right? This is the business of political philosophy. And again, it's antithetical in many ways, I feel, to the project of natural law, right? So let me try to flesh this out a bit more with respect to Hume, right? So, of course, human beings have certain kinds of intuition. Especially, you have to remember this talk, I mentioned the notions of natural virtue, This is, if you want, this implicit sympathy, which is limited sympathy, which is inherent in human nature. So ancient people, like since time immemorial, since prehistory, human beings have certain insights. Like we do not like being raped, robbed, murdered. We do not like, we do not approve, it seems naturally, of gratuitous infliction of pain and torture, right? But there's a very important reformist project in Hobbes, in Rousseau, and now in Hume, right? This notion that these ancient insights, or prehistoric maybe ancient insights, need to be enlightened by a science of society. We need a Galileo of the social world. We need a Newton of the social world to see what are the laws that animate the motion of the human body, passions, pleasure, aversion, desires, right? And find a way, some kind of common, how can we bridge the commonality of interest, find a common ground, right? So, and again, in this sense, again, artificial versus society's artificial. So maybe some of the ancient prejudicial traditional moral injunctions are good and should be retained. We don't think it's a good idea to allow people to just randomly murder each other in the middle of the road, right? But we have passions, we have irrational passions that tell us that. But Hume wants to subject these natural, unreflective moral judgments to rational scrutiny. And he wants to say that really, at the end of the day, the only thing which is virtue is that which conduces to the common good. David Hume gives a very irreverent example. He says, monks who mortify the flesh, this may be called virtue, but in and of itself, that's not necessarily good. Right? Mortification of the flesh, Christian self-denial is not necessarily a good thing. It's like providing public benefit, education, or David Hume was an older contemporary and an older friend to Adam Smith, and Adam Smith looked up to David Hume. So certain maybe institutions of public commerce improve the lot of everybody or almost everybody, and that is why we call, let's say, honesty in trade a virtue, right? But we have to be careful. Again, what people naturally find what people find immediately pleasurable or displeasurable is not necessarily in line with the long-term rational interest of society. Again, and in this sense, once again, I keep coming back to this attack on the natural law tradition. It is a matter of construction of a science of politics. It is a matter of negotiation, and different societies could have different laws, as opposed to, again, this one idea of natural universal law. And any kind of, again, virtue and legitimacy is based on common interest. And if we try to push this idea further out into relationships between the states, likewise, if we want some kind of rational international law, it should also be based on common interest, now common interest between the states. And maybe, who knows, maybe you can even find some utopian ideas of perpetual peace, although Hume doesn't really talk about this. I suppose the last thing I want to mention in this immediate segment is, again, there's this problem that, because society has to be constructed artificially, you have these artificial virtues which are not natural, right? People need to be educated, habituated, right? And especially through the use of punishment, into accepting these norms. And these norms very often are going to be, accepted by people uncritically. In fact, that's the idea behind habituation, right? Habituation means like automatic behavior. Hume, again, is very critical, very wary of religion, and he thinks that society can survive without religion. Habituation without religion is more than enough. But on the other hand, it is clear that if people are, again, habituated, educated, punished into obeying the social norms, this gives the government a disproportionate amount of power. It opens the system to abuses, right? So I feel that there's, a bit of a wariness, right, on the part of David Hume. And the only real solution I think that Hume can offer, the only real protection of a common person in the street against the abuses by the government that Hume can offer, is doing political philosophy. Understanding that the only rational basis behind norms of justice is common interest. And the more we understand this, the more we thematize this, the more are we in a position to supervise the government. And again, Hume is against revolution, but maybe careful, cautious reform can move us gradually in the direction of better institutions, better laws. Now, so I already mentioned how, again, against the ideas of natural law, Hume believes that there is no property right in nature. Property is deeply artificial. Now, he also thinks that property rights are beneficial, but the justification of property is that it benefits society. And again, we saw this actually in Locke, and I mentioned in Adam Smith that the justification, it seems, for obligation is that society is acting in your interest. So especially this makes sense when we talk about the poorest or the most disadvantaged members of society. Again, this idea of the, Adam Smith was a younger contemporary and a younger friend of David Hume, that the poor are expected to obey the same laws of society because society is in everybody's interest, also in the interest of the poor. Only then, right? And you can see kind of the flip side, that some kind of exploitative regime, like, Karl Marx is going to accuse capitalism of being inherently exploitative, right? If Marx's arguments were true, it seems that David Hume would, together with Marx, would be in favor of maybe not necessarily revolution, but at least reform, right? And I mentioned that, of course, again, Hume wants to reason, again, does not believe in the right of revolution, in the sense that revolution is always seems to be like in and of itself, revolution is always violent and problematic. So unless circumstances become really dire, you should never resort to revolution. But of course, Marx in the Communist Manifesto is going to say that precisely the circumstances have become so dire that the workers have nothing to lose but their chains. So revolution is the only possible solution. So I kind of want us to see these ideas in the context of one another, and how potentially, the conservative arguments of Hume can be turned to, some form of socialist project. And I suppose one other technical thing I want to mention is that I keep talking about passions, education, habituation, punishment, right? It's a whole separate discussion. But again, Hume does not believe in free will. And notice that uniquely, this gives him a different kind of understanding of, again, justice and punishment. Again, human beings we do not have values with capital V, or justice with capital J. There's small v values and small j justice, which are rooted in individual passions and rooted in the common interest. And so when society punishes criminals, we can only really do this, we can only really justify our behavior as like self-defense. We do this in common interest, maybe for restitution or crime prevention, right? So there's some kind of implicit criticism of vengefulness, like punishment for revenge in Hume, like enlightened forms of punishment should be more humane, should try to maybe reform the criminal or quarantine the criminal. But one issue I want to highlight, and I will be returning to this topic in later classes definitely, that actually, so many people would say, well, how can you punish criminals if they are also just as pre-programmed to commit crimes by their nature, by their passions as everybody else? Well, I feel that Hume is actually in the best position to give an answer to this question. Because what Hume is going to say is that, look, if people were really free, like many Christian philosophers believe that human beings are free, then punishment could have no effect on the soul. It is only because human beings are like robots, we would say today, like these rational calculators. It is only because of that the threat of punishment can actually deter the criminal from committing a crime. It is only if the people are determined to act in a certain way by their passions. It is only if humans right, and humans are determined to behave in a certain way by passions, only then punishment can be effective by acting on the human passions. A deep and important idea that we will be coming back to in later classes. So in this segment, I want to once again highlight very important reliance on a particular notion of human nature implicit in Hume's account. Again, I keep talking how in this proto-utilitarian fashion, Hume wants to say that justice is nothing else but common interest. But in order for there to be a common interest, right, we need to make assumptions about human nature. If you want, we need to have a common human nature, at least by and large. At least most people need to have this common nature in order for society to be possible at all. So I want to ultimately get to free rider problem, but let me start from afar, right? So students sometimes ask me, why do atheists get out of bed in the morning? That's an interesting question. Why do atheists get out of bed in the morning? And again, Hume is a very fruitful philosopher to interrogate on this question, because Hume's skepticism shows a deeply disconcerting picture of the world. Again, if we were perfectly rational, it seems, with Hume we would have to agree that we would just be paralyzed by doubt. And, there would be no understanding of what is the meaning of life, and therefore no sense of getting out of bed in the morning. But you see, Hume, again, offers a very interesting answer to this challenge. He says, it is because our passions are stronger than our reason. Actually, as a matter of fact, atheists, just as everybody else, gets out of bed in the morning because they cannot help getting out of bed in the morning, right? Your passions take over, your body takes over. Reason is not strong enough to sort of make us stay in bed, right? We overcome skeptical doubt not by a rational argument, but by a set of irrational passions. But it means, very importantly, that because human beings are driven by passions, these passions come from somewhere. To some extent, again, we mentioned in terms of this artificial virtues, society can do something to our passions through habituation, through education, through threat of punishment. Society can operate on our passions, but there needs to be some kind of commonality of passions in order for society to be possible. However, as societies become complex, again, in terms of this artificial virtues, this building an arch, the common interest and the individual, immediate, narrow, selfish motivation could come apart more and more. And so the free rider problem, this is one of the key problems in the entire history of Western philosophy, but it's a big problem for Hume. Why would you, at the end of the day, it's like paying taxes, maybe it's in the common interest, but of course, if you could get away with not paying taxes, if the society is sufficiently large, there would be no immediate harm to that. Society might not even notice. So natural virtues in a small society, when one individual free rides, it is obvious that this individual is harming the society, and maybe it's obvious to them that they're harming themselves. Again, if you imagine like a small polis, again, ancient polis fighting against one another, the actions of a single hoplite can decide the battle quite easily, right? But when society becomes larger, you get more and more incentives to free ride, right? And so on the one hand, Hume wants to solve this, again, through education, through habituation, through punishment. This should remind us again of Rousseau, this necessity of the lawgiver. Human nature needs to be changed in order for societies, good societies, to be possible. But at the end of the day, I feel that Hume understands that sort of, again, at the end of the day, it might not be enough, especially because who will educate the educators? Who will police the policemen, right? And so, for his own part, within his own temperament, Hume points to a subtle pleasure of a clear conscience, right? And we can be reminded of these ancient Greek notions of ataraxia, which is freedom from disturbance, freedom from pain. Again, another deep similarity between, let's say, Sextus Empiricus or Epicurus on the one hand, and David Hume here, right? This preference for ataraxia, this calm pleasure of just being satisfied with a clear conscience, as opposed to this pleonexic desire to have more and more than your fair share. And again, you will see, again, Epicurus says that human beings are driven by passion, but the best way to become happy is to moderate your passion. And likewise, we see this deeply Epicurean quality in Hume. Right? Human beings are driven by passion, but the best way to actually satisfy your desires often is to limit your desires, right? And Hume has this very characteristic phrase which could remind us of exactly Epicurus, that yes, the government might not be able to perfectly solve the free rider problem by realigning the interests, but at the end of the day, Hume wants to say, why do you want to steal, rape, rob, or murder? You are trading the sublime happiness of a clear conscience for what he calls worthless toys. And of course, whether, this balance of interest, what do you prefer? Toys that you can get by stealing or a clear conscience? This has to be a question of passions, right? So to some extent, maybe habituation can work with this, but at the end of the day, Hume has to assume that for society to be possible, right, the critical mass of people needs to actually prefer the pleasure of clear conscience. Again, it's a strong assumption about human nature. Maybe you could have some kind of evolutionary argument or evolutionary psychological argument why human beings evolve in such a way throughout, geological timescales. But of course, Hume was writing before Darwin, so he doesn't know anything about these arguments. So he just has to assume certain issues about human nature. But at the end of the day, if people by nature are psychopaths and maniacs, and they do not care about the laws of justice and do prefer to them, the boon of stealing is not worthless toys, but sort of they're in it for the thrill. Again, these degenerate and noxious creatures, in the words of Locke, or again, these glory-seeking animals, in the words of Hobbes, people who want to be glorified, right? Epicurus talks about them driven by amour propre, maybe. Rousseau would say people who want others to envy them, who want others to tremble in their presence, in terror. With these kinds of people, you can have neither society nor security. The only thing you can do is quarantine them. Not because this runs against natural justice with a capital J, but because, again, society, in a deep sense, is acting in self-defense. So, in this segment, I want to somehow try to say more clearly what I think is the most basic takeaway point from David Hume's philosophy. Not necessarily the most important, but definitely the most basic, the takeaway point which I want everybody to be comfortable with, right? So we, in this course, this is a course in political philosophy, but we find ourselves talking about morality very often. For many philosophers, not for all, but for many philosophers, political philosophy is just a certain kind of extension of moral philosophy. Good questions of goodness and the question of common good is the proper domain of politics. So we have seen by now two different theories of morality. There is, if you want, and we have to be careful with this terminology, but Anyway, we have the emotivist theories of morality, and you could say the rationalist theories of morality. So the emotivist theories of morality, this is especially very much associated with figures such as Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes, David Hume, and later down the line we'll talk about John Stuart Mill. I would also place Rousseau into this category. The notion that nothing is good or evil in and of itself. I talk about this transition from teleological to mechanistic worldview. This is very much the mechanistic worldview. You understand, I'm rooting for this side. So take it, obviously you should take what I say with a grain of salt. I am not an impartial observer, right? The idea that nothing is good or evil in and of itself. As Hobbes says, whatever is the object of your desire, you call good. Hume says, reason is the slave of the passions. Hume will say that it is not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of my finger. Hume says. It may be contrary to passions, but it's not contrary to reason, right? So morality is contingent upon our passions. Passions tell us what is good. It is an emotivist theory of morality because basically it says that, whenever we call something good, it's like we are expressing an emotion. Yeah, we like that. Do more of it, please. When we call something bad, we say, we don't like that, please stop it, right? And there's a very important relativist element in the emotivist picture. The morality is going to be relative to the nature of individuals who make up your society. So if different species had different natures, then presumably they could have different moral laws. Imagine, I don't know, aliens or some kind of animal societies if those exist, right? So relativism, right? So if we say that there are laws derived rationally, they can only be derived from common passions. So the notions of individual goodness or the notions of political justice or political virtue are contingent upon common interest, are dependent upon the contingent facts of human nature, if you want. And if human nature was different, or if it was changing somehow, who knows? I mean, Karl Marx is going to talk about how technological change changes the nature of human societies and also changes human nature and therefore changes definitions of morality, historicism, right? So again, contingent upon common interest, right? And this also means that obligation is always conditional. You obey because it is in your interest to obey. And there are always limits of obligation. If society becomes so tyrannical that you get nothing out of being a member of the society, you are always entitled to rebel, revolt, make revolution, whatsoever, whatever. And this is potentially the reformist and the progressive element of this side of the board. So this is Hume, but a good way to understand a philosopher is by contrasting the philosopher with what he is not, he or she is not. So on the rationalist side of the story, and I'm sort of portraying Locke along these lines, but Locke does not really have a fully fledged, fully worked out theory of morality. So this is why Locke is with a question mark. I have to fill in a lot of gaps in order to make Locke work in this fashion. And you can have a different interpretation of Locke. You could put Locke on this side of the board, but I'm not going to do that. But first and foremost, this picture has to be associated with the works of Immanuel Kant, whom we'll talk about next time. Again, this idea that no, it is reason, unaided reason alone that tells you what is good. That there's a derivation in some sense, some kind of analytic, well, not necessarily an analytic but an a priori. There's some kind of an a priori derivation that tells you what is good, independently of any kind of human nature. It should be absolutism, absolute objective rules of universal justice that for Kant are going to apply to all rational creatures of the universe, including hypothetically aliens or angels if they exist, right? So reason, pure and unaided reason, should be able to tell you what is good. Again, Hume deployed his is-ought argument in order to show that no, it is impossible. Reason in this sense is fruitless. It is incapable of giving rise to morality. But the flip side of this rationalist type of story, so if we were to try to explain Locke in this fashion, again, for Locke, reason tells us that there's a God. It's a partly an empirical argument, but you understand. Reason tells us there's a God, and reason tells us that everything belongs to God. And reason tells us, again, in Kant and in Locke, that we have unconditional obligations. that certain things we are obliged to do no matter what. Again, Locke is going to say we ought to try to preserve ourselves and others as much as possible. I wake up in the morning, maybe I feel lazy, maybe I don't feel like it, maybe, whatever other considerations I have. Locke wants to say I have an unconditional obligation to share the surplus that I have with the people who are starving through no fault of their own. Unconditional obligation, as opposed to here, obligation is always conditional. Hobbes is going to say, no, I have a duty to share only if we exist within the system of artificially created and enforced laws, and especially within a system of reciprocity. Hobbes is going to say, I have to be sure that if I give to the poor, that they will not stab me in the back. If let's say, if you help out another country, economically, again, the contemporary example from contemporary realist tradition in international relations, you need to have guarantees that they will not, let's say, use this financial aid to build nuclear bombs and then blackmail you. Again, Hobbes' pessimistic notion of human nature. But Locke is going to say, no, it's your unconditional duty to God, and you can count on the poor not stabbing you in the back, because you assume for Locke that everybody knows that there's God's law of reason, right? And Kant is even more uncompromising. We'll talk about this more next time. Kant, for example, says that even if there's a murderer who is looking for your friend, your unconditional obligations, for example, you have an obligation to never lie, says Kant. It's an exceptionalist rule, and it is never right to lie. Even if you are trying to save your friend from a murderer, you should not tell the lie. And at the end of the day, Kant wants to create a morality which is completely independent of notions of pleasure and pain of the passions. And this is going to be an important divide. Again, I'm trying to set up the next lecture. This is going to be our next topic. But I want you to see these two sides of the board, these two sides of the argument, and I have to, I suppose, give a disclaimer. I feel that, again, the task of university education, the task of pedagogy is not indoctrination. So I'm not trying to get you to agree with me. I very strongly believe in the peculiarly unforced force of the better argument. So I have to give a disclaimer. My heart is very firmly with this side of the board, and I am very critical. I find this account, the rationalist account, deeply implausible. So, which is why, for methodological reasons, colleagues, I want you to take everything I say with a grain of salt. Treat this disclaimer as a declaration, like imagine I'm colorblind and I'm telling you, look, I'm colorblind, so please don't trust my judgment too much. So I'm colorblind when it comes to these two sides. I can see the positives of this, and it's very hard for me to see the positives of this side. So I think, again, a good pedagogical thing is for me to do is to encourage you to take my praise of the emotivist theory with a grain of salt and try to find faults in it, because I'm not very good at it, right? And likewise, to maybe try to be more sympathetic to this side of the board, because it's difficult for me to be sympathetic. And, at the end of the day, definitely 100%, you should make your own conclusion. And I suppose, especially, when I teach this class face-to-face, again, to continue this methodological exposition, I want to say that if it turns out that there are good reasons for this side and, big problems with this side, I want to know about them. Because again, to do philosophy is to follow the peculiarly unforced force of the better argument whenever the argument may lead. Again, so far I find myself sympathetic to this side of the board, but I'm very much open to the possibility of changing my mind. And this is why I insert this, again, bit of disclaimer into this part. So one other slightly complicated and slightly technical, but actually very important topic that we see in David Hume is this idea, which later is going to be associated with this phrase, social construction of reality. Social construction of reality. So Hume allows us to peer into this process, right? So he tries to alert our attention to the fact that, to a very large extent, our perception is problematic. We do not see the world as it really is. In many ways, our mind actively constructs the world. This is going to be a huge topic when we get to Immanuel Kant next time. But actually, in the 20th century, with philosophers such as Martin Heidegger, or especially the French post-structuralism, like Michel Foucault, right? This is going to be a very important idea as well, right? And the simplest way to explain this is to say that perception, for Hume, is to a large extent imagination, or to some extent imagination. Perception is to some extent imagination. Our mind is not just passive, it actively constructs our experience. So the immediate metaphor for this is the artistic metaphor, right? We've all heard the phrase, the beauty is in the eye of the beholder. The beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? Objects are not ugly or beautiful in and of themselves, right? It is our perceptual apparatus that allows us to see beauty. Especially, again, if we think about, difference between perceptual apparatuses of different species, right? What we find beautiful is not necessarily the same thing that some insects find beautiful, right? Or different kinds of animals. Some unseemly examples come to mind. Don't necessarily want to word them, but you voice them out loud. But you can fill in your own ideas. Now, so in some sense, what we're talking about are illusions. Now, in quotes, because if we cannot really see reality as it really is, it's hard to know exactly what is an illusion and what is reality, right? In order for you to really be able to talk about reality and illusion, right, you need to be able to step outside of your own head and compare things as they are in themselves to the way that they appear to us. But that's impossible. We always only see things the way they appear to us. We can never compare them to the way they are. We can only compare the way a thing appears from one angle to the way it appears from another angle, right? I can literally look at different angles of this marker, or let's say if I take a microscope, right, I'm going to see this marker under a different aspect, right? So I can compare one vision to another vision, but it's always mediated by my perceptual apparatus. I cannot stand outside of my condition, right? But be that as it may, right? So Hume draws our attention to so many things that we do not actually see in the world, but we imagine. So one of them, for example, is continuity of the self. Hume says there is no empirical or no rational basis for me believing that I am the same person I was yesterday. This is an illusion of my mind that's created by my memory. In fact, again, there's this quasi-Buddhist picture, quasi-Buddhist illusion in Hume that maybe there's no continuity, there's no causation. The world is destroyed and recreated from moment to moment, and only because the moments resemble each other fairly closely, only because of that, we get an illusion of continuity, but it actually doesn't exist. Another example we talked about is causation. Again, I can throw this marker to the ground, and I feel that I have caused the marker to fall. I have imparted a certain impulse to it. But actually, do I know that? How do I know? Or like, again, my arm goes up. Is it because I wanted it to go up? Do I see the necessary connection between my wanting and the arm going up? Could it be that unbeknownst to me, my arm has been paralyzed, and it just so happens, this is a view known in philosophy as occasionalism. On this occasion, I decided for my arm to go up, and it goes up for completely different reasons, unrelated to my decision, right? Again, so we do not see the cause. Our mind imagines that there's cause. And again, you can illustrate this by certain clever experiments. Again, I encourage you to look this up, where you can very patently induce a feeling of causation in people when there's in fact no causation, right? But much more importantly for our purposes, since we're talking about moral and political philosophy, are questions of justice. Because Hume is going to insist nothing is good or evil in and of itself. Nothing is vice or virtue in and of itself. Nothing is a crime in and of itself. It is our mind, our passions more specifically, that make us imagine certain things. Right? And he gives this interesting example. He talks about parricide, the murder of one's parent. Is that necessarily a vice or a crime? Now, Hume wants to say that, of course, we have certain strong feelings attached to this, but again, feelings are not necessarily good guides to reality. But in the act of a child killing its parent, rationally speaking, there's nothing abhorrent and nothing unjust. And he actually gives a very interesting example. He gives an example of an oak tree. He says, imagine that there's an oak tree, and an oak tree has an acorn, right? And the acorn begins to grow underneath the oak tree. There's an old oak tree, so the acorn begins to grow larger and larger into an even larger oak tree and overshadows the parent oak. And so the parent oak withers away and dies. Hume wants to say, is there some kind of injustice in that? Some rationally demonstrable injustice? Again, Hume's implications, no, absolutely not. And so he wants to say that, again, through our passions and also through social habituation, we begin to perceive certain things as vices and crimes. But nothing is vice or crime in and of itself. We see things as vicious or criminal relative to our passions and relative to our social background. And you can continue and extend this discussion. You could say, nobody is a policeman or a magistrate in and of themselves. There's a certain kind of illusion going on there, right? Children, since they're born, since the time that they're born, they are habituated. Society imposes this idea onto them that a policeman or a magistrate, right, has particular powers, deontic powers, and you must obey certain kinds of legitimate commands, right? This authority, but in and of themselves, no people are born policemen in this sense, right? And again, this is very much relevant to a given culture. It's cultural, so social construction of reality, this cultural relativity of perception. But much more importantly, and we'll talk about this closer to the end of our course, people like Michel Foucault is going to see a deeply important political aspect of this way of seeing things, again, because Foucault is going to insist also that nobody is a criminal, nobody is a madman in and of themselves, right? But these notions of criminality or madness are deployed politically for political reasons, right? They are not innocent, not neutral. And this is, again, this is a deep and important question, deep and important dimension of political philosophy, because on the one hand, I feel that Hume is going to say that these kinds of illusions are necessary, but on the other hand, these illusions, if they just run unchecked, could be dangerous. And so kind of a properly well-constituted, properly enlightened society should work through public discussion to separate out those illusions, like stopping at the red light, right? So, which feels obligatory, right? Those illusions which are conducive to the common good, and leave them in place, and maybe find illusions. You can imagine all sorts of prejudice, racial prejudice, social prejudice, prejudice against slaves, for example. Those illusions which need to be corrected through this, again, project. We mentioned this last time when we talked about Jean-Jacques Rousseau, this idea, the project of enlightenment, that by understanding the laws by which society operates, we can reshape the laws of society in a rational fashion such that these contingent interests of the individual can be brought in line with the interest of society. This rationalist project of utopian, progressive, humanist project of, again, using the science of political philosophy in order to restructure, reshape society on a more rational, more humane basis.